I remind you of two things. First of all, I'm wearing this T-shirt in solidarity and remembrance of the victims of the Pulse nightclub massacre. It is important that we remember that hate oftentimes happens, and those of us who are not directly affected are tempted to go on with our lives as if we do not recall that it happened. None of us would treat 9/11 as if it was nothing. None of us would treat the murder of Martin Luther King as if it was nothing. And therefore, we should not treat the massacre of 49 sisters and brothers who are LGBTQ in Orlando, Florida, as if it did not happen. And so I wear this T-shirt in solidarity with our LGBTQ brothers and sisters and in remembrance of that massacre. I also call your attention to the stickers that are on the pedestal out front with the bulletins calling for 100% inclusion. Our congregation is associated with the Association of Welcoming and Affirming Baptists. We are a congregation that welcomes and affirms and believes in the full inclusion of all persons, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity. And therefore, with the Southern Baptist Convention and the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship meeting this week in Dallas, and especially since the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship is meeting this week, for the first time after it reaffirmed in some kind of way its bigotry against LGBTQ people, the Association of Welcoming and Affirming Baptists has a mission today to encourage as many people as possible to wear these stickers. And after we get done, I'm going to ask somebody to take a picture of us. I'm going to put it on my Facebook, and we're going to do it because we want to make sure that our congregation is affirming our solidarity with our brothers and sisters who are LGBTQ. And we're standing up for inclusion, full inclusion. Full inclusion means you don't treat some people as if they don't count. You don't treat some people as if they're not good enough. You don't treat some people as if they somehow are morally disqualified based on who they are or who they love from being involved in God's service. And so that's why we are wearing these stickers, passing them out. I hope that you will share that with us. Anybody wants to know how come you're wearing the sticker, tell them. I learned this little thing here is a Chinese symbol for love and forgiveness and reconciliation. No, I do not know Chinese. I cannot read Chinese. And until I was told this was a Chinese symbol, I didn't know what it was. However, it fits the issues of reconciliation and love and healing that we need to be involved in. Now let me make two clarifying statements about this sermon from the outset. First, this sermon is not a moral or a theological defense of poverty. Let me say it again. This sermon is not a moral or a theological defense of poverty. And secondly, this sermon is not a moral or a theological defense of inequality or male privilege. Please do not read this text or understand this sermon as meaning that inequality and poverty are divinely ordained. If you take that from this sermon, you will have taken something I have never said and do not intend to say today. And if I find out you said it, I'm going to find you and say, when did you hear that? And what were you doing when you heard it? Amen. I don't mean to intend to say or suggest that poverty and hunger and inequality are ordained by God. That said, let me emphasize that this passage challenges our ideas about sufficiency and scarcity. sufficiency, say sufficiency, and scarcity. In this lesson, the prophet Elijah issued a warning about a drought that ultimately was going to last 3 years. That's a long time to not have any rain. The northern kingdom of Israel was then ruled by King Ahab, considered by commentators to have been the most wicked and unjust of all the rulers mentioned in the Hebrew Testament. Ahab and his wife, Queen Jezebel, who names their boys Ahab anymore, and who names their girls Jezebel? Nobody, right? Ahab and Queen Jezebel led a religious sect devoted to worship of Baal, or some say Baal, the chief male god of the Phoenicians. According to Canaanite and Mesopotamia belief, Baal was the farm god, the fertility god, who held power to increase agricultural crops, livestock, and farming conditions to include families. And so, if people were having trouble having children, there was thought that if they just made an offering or prayed to Baal, they would be blessed with fruitfulness. So when Elijah, the prophet of God, predicted a drought that was going to last until his God said otherwise, his prophecy asserted that Baal, the god worshipped by King Ahab and Queen Jezebel, was a false god. My God has ordered me to predict a drought, no rain, until he says so. What's your God going to do about it? Your God's supposed to be in charge of rain. Let's see if your God can show up today or tomorrow or until my God says otherwise. The location of the Wadi Cherith that we read about in this text is unknown. This is the place where Elijah was fed bread and meat delivered by ravens every morning and every evening. The point is that God provided food every day for the prophet. God provided food every day for the prophet. And this is really sort of a take on something that runs in the Hebrew scripture. Remember, in the wilderness passage from Egypt into Canaan, there was manna in the morning and manna in the evening, but Elijah got bread and meat every morning and bread and meat every evening. In the passage about the Israelites moving from Egypt to Canaan, they had to go up and pick up the manna from the ground. Elijah had his groceries delivered every morning, every evening by the ravens. The point is, even without Elijah having a grocery business, even without Elijah hunting, even without Elijah having a farm, God provided bread and meat every morning, and he had a water supply there at the brook. God provides. You with me so far? You would think Elijah was broke, but notice, God provides. Eventually, the water dried up at the brook. After all, it was a drought. So, what's the prophet going to do? At verses 8 through 10, the story takes another turn. The prophet is directed to travel from the Wadi Cherith to Zarephath, a town along the coastline of the Mediterranean Sea that was in the region of Sidon, in the very heartland of Baal worship. Now say Zarephath 5 times. Zarephath, 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 Zarephath. See, you got it down, didn't you? Easy. Now I had to practice, all right? I had to practice to get this down because otherwise I trip over it. Look closely at verse 9. Notice the word of the Lord to the prophet. Go now to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and live there. For I have commanded a widow there to feed you. Earlier, the prophet was led to the brook, the Wadi Cherith, and the word was, I have commanded the ravens to bring you bread and meat. Now the prophet learns, I have commanded a widow to feed you. What is this foolishness? What is this foolishness? I know you're thinking, he did not go there. Go into the heartland of Baal worship as prophet of God. You go into another country where another religion is practiced and go live with a widow. Now you need to understand that in the Bible, the standard for the very worst kind of poverty is widows and orphans. Understand, this is before Social Security, okay? She did not have Social Security. This is a woman who is no longer under her father's house. She does not have a husband. She does not have a brother who is taking care of her. She is what they call an uncovered woman. And in a patriarchal age where women had to be, quote, covered under the protection of a man, father, husband, older brother, in order to be provided for. And the prophet is told, go live with this woman, this widow. What in the world? The widow is going to be poorer than he is. But that's the word. Notice, that's the word that Elijah gets. And then the plot gets even thicker. Once Elijah reaches Zarephath, Elijah finds the widow. Notice she's never mentioned by name. I have an issue with that. If she's very important, and even Jesus mentions her, somehow we don't have her name. That's probably because guys wrote this. If it had been women written this, we'd have had her name, right? Okay. All right. I'm not the only one who has that issue. Okay, thank you. Elijah found her. She's not only a widow, she's also a single mother. She's a widow with a mouth to feed. She's down to her last food supply. When Elijah first encounters her, she is gathering sticks for firewood so she can prepare the last food she had in her pantry for herself and her son. Now, you've got to imagine Elijah thinking, Lord, you sent me here? I had to come all the way out of my country into another country where Baal is worshipped, and I'm going to live. You said go live there? She's starving. She's about to starve. In the face of her situation, Elijah has the gall to demand that she give him, first of all, some water. Remember what I told you. This sermon is not a moral or theological endorsement of male privilege or inequality. Don't go home and say, okay, bring me some water. Don't go there, all right? Don't go there. Don't get in your feelings. Elijah had the gall to demand that she bring him some water, and even worse, have him bring some bread first. In other words, show me hospitality before you even feed yourself. Even after she tells him, I'm down to my last meal, I'm getting firewood together, I don't have but enough food for me and my boy, he has, I understand what your situation is. First, make me some cake. The key verses for this passage are at verses 13 through 16. Elijah said to her, to the widow, "Do not be afraid. Go and do as you've said. Gather sticks of firewood, prepare your last meal you intended to share with your son. But first make me a little cake of it and bring it to me, and afterwards make something for yourself and your son. For thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, the jar of meal will not be emptied, and the jug of oil will not fail until the day that the Lord sends rain on the earth." She went and did as Elijah said, so that she as well as her household ate for many days. The jar of meal was not emptied, neither did the jug of oil fail, according to the word of the Lord that he spoke by Elijah. Elijah challenged the widow to rethink the meaning of enough. Elijah challenged the widow to rethink whether she had enough food to share. Elijah challenged the widow to rethink the whole idea that Baal supplied the rain needed for agriculture and food. Elijah challenged the widow to rethink the notion that she was too poor to extend hospitality to a stranger, let alone a stranger from another region and from another religion. Now, this passage is a direct challenge to a lot of things. We don't encounter people who call themselves Baal worshipers today, at least not by name. But the Baal mindset about prosperity is very much with us. It shows up in the claims of politicians and investment advisors. Their policies and their investment portfolios and their plans will make people wealthy and healthy. The truth declared by this passage is that God and God alone is the source of life. God and God alone, not your pantry. Not your pantry. And anything that is trusted other than God and God alone is the Baal we put our hope in. Not the New York Stock Exchange, not your personal investment portfolio, not whatever amount you have in your bank account, whether it's big or little, or not at all. At every turn in this lesson, the message to us is clear. God provides. God provides, always. God provides when we have plenty. God provides when our supplies run low. God provides when we think we have things figured out. God provides when we don't know which way to go. God provides the rain, not Baal. God provides when there is no rain, when there's a drought. God provides when unexpected needs arise that aren't in our budget, such as a hungry and tired preacher from out of town showing up with another religion when you're down to your last meal. And God provides when you think you have a whole lot of stuff and you can rest for a while. God provides. That's the point. That's the point. That's the point. Enough is defined by God providing. And that's the meaning of a theology of abundance. A theology of abundance rather than a theology of scarcity. We are tempted to believe in a theology of scarcity, that we do not have enough, and we have to worry about whether there's enough. Nowhere in this passage do we see any sign that Elijah had to worry about whether the ravens would show up the next morning. And if they showed up, whether they'd be without any food. Whether they show up this morning, are they going to come back this afternoon? You know, I ate this morning. I'm getting hungry. It's getting time to hit the afternoon now. I wonder if they're going to show up. Well, they show up this evening. I want to show up tomorrow morning. No, God provides. The lesson that we have here challenges the whole idea of scarcity, that we don't have enough. According to this lesson, God provides food and water even in times of drought. And this lesson is biblical for the foundational idea that we heard the elders say a long time ago, that God is bread in a starving land and water in. You heard it, didn't you? You heard it, didn't you? That's theologically true. Folks who didn't know how to spell theology said God is bread in a starving land and water in dry places. And because God provides, we will always have enough, even during times of drought. God will provide even when the stock market crashes. God will provide even when crooks steal and tyrants oppress. God will provide even when we, like the widow from Zarephath, are down to our last. We're worn out and believe that all is lost. And this lesson also shows that enough is always more than we need. Let me say it again. Enough is always more than we need. We have the notion that enough means I'm barely making it. Look at this text. This lesson shows that enough is always more than we need, even when our need seems to be greater than what we have on hand. Elijah didn't have a plan for sustaining himself when he predicted that drought. He didn't have a budget. He didn't have a supply of water. He didn't have a water trailer house following behind him. It's going to be a drought. Brook runs out. He didn't have a plan for that. Now, that doesn't mean you don't plan, but it means you don't worry. It does mean you don't worry. You don't fret. You don't act like you don't trust God. You don't act like your plan is God. God provided more than Elijah needed when he was living by the water chariot. And God provided more than Elijah needed when he was living with the widow. Elijah had enough, and enough was always more than Elijah needed. It was more than the widow needed. She didn't think she had enough, but what this text shows is that it was more than she needed. She just didn't know how much she had. And God provided for the widow more than she expected. She didn't expect her food supply to be consumed by an uninvited stranger. You know, company always shows up when you don't have much to eat, right? But understand this. She had more than enough. God provided. She didn't expect to have to shelter a homeless preacher. God provided. She didn't expect God to stretch her worldview. She simply wanted to get her sticks and prepare a last meal for her son and herself and die. The theology of abundance shown by this passage is made clear by two references. Don't miss them. Don't miss them. Repeat after me. The jar of meal and the jug of oil. Say it again. The jar of meal and the jug of oil. Now look at somebody and say, don't look at your jar and don't trust your jug. Elijah had the widow know that the bottom of the jar of meal and the bottom of the jug of oil did not define the extent of their resources. Here's your teaching point. If you're making notes, here's your teaching point. Whatever you think your bottom line is, if it isn't spelled G-O-D, you are wrong. Whatever you think your bottom line is, if it is not spelled G-O-D, you are wrong. I don't care what the number is, whether it's big or little. If it's not spelled G-O-D, it's wrong. What does the text say? The jar of meal shall not, what? The jar of meal shall not what? Be emptied. And the jug of oil shall not what? They're eating every day. They're eating every day. But the jar of meal and the jug of oil were not emptied because God was the bottom, not the bottom of the jar or the bottom of the jug. Here's our problem. We spend so much time looking at the bottom of our jars and the bottom of our jugs, we can't think about God. And so guess what? We have turned the bottom of our jars and the bottom of our jugs into God. Guess what? That's called Baal worship. Because all of a sudden, the budget is your God. Now, don't walk around and say, preacher doesn't care about budget. Yes, I do. I know the budget's not God. I know I stand on good authority. There's something in the text that says, I once was young, but now I am old. I have never seen the righteous forsaken, nor his seed beg bread. Well, preacher, why, if this is true, are so many people poor? I'm glad you asked. Because we're not doing what the widow did. What happened with the widow? The preacher shows up hungry and without, and she shared. We don't have too little. We have too many people who have enough who will not share. Hello? You understand? If I have enough and God is enough, then I have enough not only for me, but I have enough to share. That's what this text shows, isn't it? This text shows that no matter how little we have enough to share. Now, let me tell you why I'm preaching this. How many times have you heard folks say, we don't have enough members? We don't have enough money to. We don't have enough young people to. We don't have put enough, fill in the blank. Next time you get that thought, remember this text. And ask yourself, what jar bottom are you looking at to define enough? Are you looking at the bottom of your jar of meal or the bottom of your jug of oil? Or are you looking at the bottom of God? Because see, poor is when God runs out. We're really broke when God runs out. Until then, all the rest of it is we just not sharing. Okay? Yes, people are suffering, but they're suffering because we aren't sharing. We are not practicing generosity and hospitality. God gives us enough, but only because we don't share are people suffering because they don't have enough. How is it that in a nation that has as many people as heavy as I am, there can be so many people hungry? How is it that we can throw away so much food and have so many people hungry? How is it that we can have homes that are vacant, nobody lives in them, and we can't house people who don't have homes? How is it that we cannot share? Why? We're looking at our bottom line, our little jugs and our little jars, and said, unless we get a profit from it, yeah, unless we get a profit from it, we're not going to share. Let me close this sermon, because there's one more learning point here. Faith isn't foolhardy, so this passage is not supporting the idea of wasting what God provides. Instead, it forces us to discard the excuses we give that we aren't rich enough, we don't have enough, aren't strong enough, aren't numerous enough, aren't smart enough, aren't popular enough, or aren't whatever else enough. Enough is always guaranteed by God, even when we can't detect it. Our problem is we define enough by the bottoms of our jars and our jugs rather than the riches of God's grace and God's mercies. Now, as in this passage, people are still migrating, fleeing violence, fleeing hunger, fleeing other threatening conditions. And across the world, national and local leaders are arguing about whether to admit immigrant people. In this country and across the world. We got enough space to put immigrant people. We have enough to share immigrant people. But we refuse to do it. The issue in the world and in the United States is whether or not we're going to follow the example of this widow of Zarephath or turn our backs on hospitality and generosity and the needs of our migrating neighbors. Now, like always, those who believe in God must live out the truth shown by this lesson. No matter how bad things are, we always have more than enough we need to share. No matter who's in power, we have a duty to live out the theology of abundance. Why? Because we trust God to faithfully provide whatever is needed to be agents of love and mercy and hope and justice and hospitality and peace. This means we have no excuse to pretend that we don't have enough. We have no excuse to act like we are always worried. We have no excuse because the coffers are going low. We have no excuse for closing our hearts and closing our hands and closing our heads to the needs of others who are suffering. And this lesson forces us to admit that we too often place our faith on Baal-like systems defined by how much we see above the bottom of our jars. You see, we see bottom line, and we don't know how much is above the bottom. And if I feel like there's enough above the bottom, I'll share. No. She was down to her bottom. She was looking at the bottom. She was scraping the bottom. And the lesson is, even when you're scraping the bottom, God provides more than enough. We have sufficiency and abundance, even when we think we're looking at the bottom. The false Baal pantheon, followed by King Ahab and Queen Jezebel, is mirrored in our time by the false ideology of free market capitalism that places wealth in terms of how much you have in the bank, how much you got above your paycheck, how much you got in the savings account. Lesson: if rich folks can go broke because the stock market crashes, don't think you can worry yourself into being rich. Hello? If Bernie Madoff can steal from rich folk all they got, you're not going to be able to plan and figure out how to keep all your stuff and keep them broke. God provides. This bottom line theology doesn't empower people to take care of each other. It basically says, I'm looking out for me. I got enough for me. There is a little Jesus text on this before I close. You recall the lesson Jesus, where a rich man had a good crop and built all his crops in the barns. He says, I have built many barns, good crops. What shall I do? I shall build new barns. And what's the lesson? Thy food this night, your soul is required. It is not enough for us to bank on so much. It is enough for us to bank on God, who is everything. Well, the good news is that God provides more than we think. More than we think is enough. More than we think is enough, even when we think we don't have enough. And when this is our faith, God is the real bottom line. When this is our faith, we define and redefine the meaning of enough. No longer do we say, we're too little to do this. Jesus started out with 12 folks, and one of them turned on him, and the rest of them left him. Hello? How come we think we're too little? Moses walked into Egypt with his brother on a stick. How come we think we're too little? David walked into the face of Goliath with a slingshot and some rocks. How come we think we're too little? Mary didn't have anything but a promise from an angel. How come we think we're too little? We have to get over this notion that we are not enough. Our sufficiency is of God. And when God provides abundantly, and God does that so we will share. Amen. Let's live out that faith.